Shall we begin?
Yes.
Okay. Good morning. Thank you for having us here today to talk about the sustainable consumption and production. Today we have the Danish ambassador, Mr. Nicolai here, and we would like to ask you a few questions on sustainable consumption and production. Okay?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you. It's a topic that's very close to the heart of Danes and my government and Danish companies, so I'd love to talk about this.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so Denmark has one of the highest level of quality of life and well-being in the developed world. So, to what extent did a sustainable approach contribute in this?
I think it has a lot to do with it. There are certainly governance issues that could be discussed about how the Danish society has been organized. But if we now, for the purpose of this interview, look more at the sustainable development policies, I think from an outset it's important to understand that there is this conviction in Denmark that the next industrial revolution is going to be green. We truly believe that there's a major transformation taking place internationally, and it's one that we have experienced ourselves and we try to be at the forefront of in changing our society into what we generally consider a more green growth path.
So what drives the initiative?
I think if we look back in history a little bit to get a perspective on it, on Danish history in particular, what happened in the 70s was that we were at that time entirely dependent on imported oil and coal for our energy consumption. Then we were hit by the energy crisis in the 1970s. Suddenly the tap was turned off and the country basically grinded to a halt. We even had to introduce car-free Sundays. That was great for somebody like me who was a kid back in the early 70s, because it meant I could go and play soccer on the highways because there were no cars at all on Sundays.
And everyone abided by that law?
Everybody abided by it, yes, because you would be fined if you didn't.
Okay.
So it was like if you imagine Jalan Tun Razak being completely empty of cars on a Sunday and people just walking about. That was what it was. I mean, now I'm sort of presenting the fun side of it, but of course it was a major shock to society. And sometimes societies need that kind of kick to act, to make action and change. And Denmark certainly got that kick in the 1970s. So a conscious decision was done to reform our energy policies completely and try and move away from this over-dependency on imported fossil fuels and try to develop more renewable energy and also change our own consumption pattern, reducing the consumption, both among companies and government institutions and certainly also private households.
I see. And was this transition very difficult for the Danes? Because changing of behavior is not easy.
No, I mean, it hasn't been easy. It hasn't been easy. I think there are four main elements to the transition. It's been a combination of tough legislation combined with taxes, for instance, on discharge of wastewater and CO2 emissions and so on. Then combined with subsidies, the carrot, if you will. If the taxes are considered the stick, then the subsidies are the carrot, making it more attractive to invest in more energy efficient household appliances, more energy efficient cars and so on, both for individuals and companies. And finally, the fourth element is education. There's been a lot of campaigns in Denmark trying to make the public understand the need to conserve water, reduce use of fossil fuels and so on. So that has been part of the environmental movement, which was already there to some extent and accelerated during the 60s, but certainly with the oil crisis of the 1970s got a whole new perspective.
I see. And all these elements that you were talking about, so government was the main coordinator to drive all this?
Well, yes, in the sense of course introducing subsidy schemes and taxes and legislating, yes, I mean that comes out of government and government policies. But the citizens, the individuals, were taking on this drive as well. And I think if you can compare it to something like buying organic food, which is very big in Denmark. I mean, people are willing to pay a premium for organic food, even though they may get what in principle is the same liter of milk, but one is organic, one is not organic, and you pay a premium because you think it's actually better for you to buy the organic. In the same way, there was a willingness on the part of the consumers to pay a premium for a more energy efficient car, even though it might be a little bit more expensive. Buy a household appliance, let's say a fridge, which is maybe not the cheapest, but it's the most energy efficient. And you would do that because you want to be a good citizen in a sense. So I think I think one should not underestimate the push from consumers and individuals for this change as well. Of course, part of it is a cost-benefit analysis by the consumer, but there's also some percentage also has to do with the willingness to actually deliberately, consciously move in that direction, demanding more energy efficient products.
So that the industry will produce more.
Which gives the industry an incentive to produce more of the energy efficient products, because not only do they are they maybe influenced by taxation and subsidies, but there's also actually demand for it.
Okay. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would ask, how is it today? So what would be, all bands are thinking this way, or do we talk about a minority, or so what would be the share of the people of Denmark practicing this?
I think it's difficult to turn it into a share, but I mean, you can look at the extent to which people buy energy efficient household appliances, for instance, and that is very high. And the willingness of Danes to use energy efficient modes of transport. If you look at Copenhagen as a city, the largest city in Denmark, every second citizen uses a bicycle to get to work or studies, which is of course not only is it healthy and it's cheap and it's efficient, but it's also very good for the environment, and it reduces the CO2 emissions and so on. And that has come about also through a mix of push and pull, in the sense that on the one hand it's very expensive to have a car. We do not have a national automotive industry, so we tax vehicles, cars, very heavily. We also tax fuel. A liter of petrol costs about 8 ringgit in Denmark, so you can really feel the pinch whenever you have to fill up the tank on your car. So that gives you an incentive to look for other means of transport, either public transport or bicycles. And bicycles then become popular because there's an efficient bicycle infrastructure in the city with bicycle lanes, and you can take your bicycle on the commuter train, on the metro. So you have this ability to integrate that means of transport, the bicycle, into the public transport system. And so you're not entirely dependent on the bicycle, but you can combine it with public transport. And you can combine it with having a car. So maybe one day you would go use your car because you have to do something particular at the end of the day maybe, and other days you would pick the bicycle. So it becomes a natural way of considering how to get from A to B.
Okay. So this means that the Danes are not that much different than all the other peoples in the world, that they also look for value for money when they make a decision, that they are looking for convenient solutions.
Yes.
So and if they are not there, they would just not be able to have this sustainable behavior, as we see.
I agree. I mean, I think a lot comes down to sort of a cost-benefit analysis of what makes good sense for you on a day-to-day basis, and I think the sort of that element of idealism maybe is more important in the beginning of certain transition processes. In Denmark, wind power is very big. We have a lot of wind, unlike Malaysia, who's in a belt near the equator with less wind, but we have quite a bit in Denmark. And the wind industry, which today employs 25,000 people, and there are 350 companies directly involved in the wind power industry in Denmark. That was started by was basically a bunch of hippies in the 1970s who thought it was fun to play around with windmills, and it was not profitable back then. But since then, technology has been developed and improved, and suddenly, it became economically feasible, and now it's become a major industry. One of the largest wind turbine manufacturers is a Danish company, and they're also there's a whole industry around that. We are testing in Denmark some of the largest windmills in the world, and they're just getting bigger and bigger. So what is happening is that the windmills are more and more put offshore, because they are getting so big that nobody wants them in their backyard. So for instance, if you fly into Copenhagen, you literally fly over these offshore windmill parks, which now generate a substantial part of the electricity and energy. In fact, there are some national targets in Denmark which may be worth also just briefly touch upon. One is that, and the most ambitious, is to completely wean the country off fossil fuels by 2050. And you have to understand that in the perspective that Denmark is actually a producer of oil and gas from the North Sea. We have a huge oil and gas industry, like Malaysia. But nevertheless, like Malaysia, we know it's running out sooner or later, and we don't think it's a future. We need to simply change the fundamental of the way that we run our economy and fuel our economy. So that's why there is that conscious decision across the political spectrum to wean Denmark off fossil fuels by 2050. And by 2035, the ambition is that all heat and electricity is generated by renewable energy sources in Denmark. And already recently, there was one particular month where half of all electricity in Denmark was generated by wind power alone. Half of all electricity was generated by wind power. So it is becoming rather big. Other renewable energy sources that are being exploited in Denmark are biofuel, biomass, solar power. That may not sound intuitively as something you would expect in Denmark, but as a matter of fact, the world's largest solar power plant is being installed and was recently inaugurated in Denmark. And there is quite a bit of research going into wave power. That has not turned out to be profitable yet, but then again, you probably need to do research for some years and maybe even decades before you realize how to be able to harness the energy from waves. Denmark is surrounded by a lot of water, so that's why that's also potentially an attractive renewable energy source.
But it's still in the initial phase right now.
It's only in the initial research phase, yes. There's a couple of large research projects undergoing in this field.
Do you have anything to add?
Sure, Mr. Ambassador, you gave a very interesting example about where the Danish energy industry has moved towards more renewable sources of energy generation. Would you say the rest of the Danish industry are also looking at green or sustainable as a way to become more competitive compared to the rest of the world?
Yeah, I think it's a good point that there's actually a substantial part of the Danish industrial sector which is now in what we call clean or green technology. It amounts to around 15 to 20% of Danish exports, depending a bit about how you calculate it, that are directly associated with renewable energy, clean energy. I mentioned the windmill industry, but also pump manufacturers, energy efficient pump manufacturers, companies that produce different elements for ventilation and air conditioning, which is also some of the most energy efficient components that you get in that particular subsector in the world. Just to mention a couple of examples, so we have some rather large industrial conglomerates in Denmark now, which are truly in the clean technology business, and many of them are present in Malaysia. Companies like Danfoss and Grundfos, they're in the pumps and air conditioning business. And there's also a factory down in Malacca called Ruge, which produce insulation. And the funny story there is that, of course, it's being used in Malaysia in completely the reverse way as it was originally intended. It was developed to insulate the houses in Northern Europe and Denmark so that we could keep the warmth in and the cold out. And here is the reverse. But again, that was an industry that grew big because there were some legislation around the energy consumption of buildings, that if you sell a building, it has to be energy certified. And it's very difficult to sell a building in Denmark that has a poor energy certificate. So everybody wants a good one. You want to be in the A ranking, and therefore you need to insulate your house well with the kind of insulation that Rockwool is producing, stone wool insulation, and energy efficient windows, which is another niche business that a couple of Danish companies are rather big in.
And you mentioned energy efficient buildings and the need to have a certificate for transactions. Is this thus an important consideration when a buyer is looking to buy a prospective building or house?
Yes, it is, because the cost of energy is so high. So you want to reduce the bill you have to pay every month for heating your house. Even though, again, we try to introduce energy efficient ways of heating houses, what we use in Denmark to a large extent is district heating, meaning that you don't have your own individual oil-fueled burner in the house, but you are part of a network, and you get your energy from a central source, and it's efficiently delivered, and that source can change the energy plant can change the source of energy that it uses. So reduce coal, take in wind power, biomass, and whatever, and use that mix, which it gives more flexibility than if individual households would have to change their energy source, which of course they can't do as flexibly as a central heating system can.
And are small and medium enterprises part of this?
District heating?
Yes.
Yes. Some of them are. Yeah. I mean, if it's developed for that particular area and it's constantly being expanded all over the country, yes, then it's both for households and for industries.
And would you also say that SMEs, small and medium enterprises, have also aligned or adjusted their operations to become more green and sustainable?
Yes, they have generally, and again, because of the same reasons that I mentioned earlier, because it's good business. I mean, there are some legislative requirements that they have to follow, which force them to apply some systems and buy some systems that mean that they can reduce their energy consumption to certain levels, reduce their CO2 emissions, discharge less polluted water, and all those kind of environmental aspects of production. So that comes from the legislation, and then there is some taxation, which also gives an economic incentive to be to turn green, if you will. And then they may even benefit from some subsidies that they can get if the government wants to encourage introduction of certain technologies. Then they might want to do it, and they will make a calculation whether it's profitable or not, and maybe that little subsidy from the government or the municipality is what makes a difference. So the entire society is being with a carrot and a stick gently pushed in one direction.
I want to come back to one point what you mentioned before, that you say that energy is very expensive commodity in Denmark, and sometimes it is said that in Malaysia energy has a low price. Is this really true when you compare it with the income? So I don't know the numbers, but if we look at the average income of a Danish household and an average income of a Malaysian household, and then come to the energy price, I mean, it is.
I see your point, and And even though a liter of petrol in Malaysia costs a lot less than in Denmark, of course, it's expensive for a low-income household in Malaysia. That's true. But then there is still that particular issue in Malaysia with the large subsidies, which from a national economic point of view are difficult to sustain, and is also the reason why the government has taken the recent moves to lower the subsidies on electricity and lower the subsidies on fuel. So there's probably no way around that it's going to be more expensive and a larger part of the income. Of the cost of running a household in Malaysia. It's probably only going one way, because it's not sustainable for Malaysia as a country to retain the subsidies it currently does.
Okay. No, I just want to say this is one aspect, and you mentioned a number of more aspects. What can change the behavior? What can drive a green growth scenario? So you always mention legislation as the first.
Mm-hmm.
Why is this?
Oh, I don't know if it needs to be the first, but I think that is. I think looking back in the Danish history of the transformation, which is still undergoing, I think legislation was probably what came first around environmental issues before climate change really became an issue. It was more about making sure that we maintain the clean water and the clean air. So it was the environmental legislation which really drove the process initially, and then later came climate change, and policies got more refined with taxation introduced on CO2 emissions and subsidies for energy efficient household appliances and so on.
Okay. I mean, is there such a phenomenon in Denmark, like we experience in some of the Southeast Asian countries, which is called the green growth?
Mm-hmm.
Can you say that Denmark is experiencing green growth development?
I think the short answer is yes, because there is a very conscious process in Denmark of trying to get onto a green development path. It's an integral part of the national policies in terms of the energy policies, environment policies, industrial policies, and it's also driven by citizens. So I think that is very much the case, that we are undergoing that process, and I think we are seeing the transformation also in our industries. That, as I mentioned earlier, now between 15 and 20% of Danish exports are directly generated from companies that are delivering clean technology products, and they are of course not doing that only for the small domestic market of 5.5 million people in Denmark. They are doing it for all the countries where this transition is becoming more important, and they would like to assess the best technology in the world. But of course, in order for such products to be interesting for consumers and companies elsewhere in the world, they need to have an economic incentive. And that is what has probably not quite been there yet in Malaysia, because electricity costs are relatively low. So there is not the same kind of economic incentive yet in Malaysia to really make a saving on your electricity bill. But it's changing. I only see things changing in one direction in Malaysia, and I think for good reasons.
So when we look at it historically, there was a time, let's say it dated back to the 1970s, when there was a change in the mindset of the Danish.
I think very much around the oil crisis in the 70s, that was a turning point.
And then the country started to become fitter or more efficient, and this also gave opportunities, maybe as a consequence, to be at the state of the art of such technologies, to develop an industry which was also competitive in the international market as a forerunner of so-called green technologies.
Yes, and I think what a way of also sort of expressing the fact that Denmark is undergoing a green growth change is the fact that in the past 30 years, the Danish economy has almost doubled, while the energy consumption has remained stagnant, and CO2 emissions have gone down. That's quite an interesting example that it's possible to de-link, decouple economic growth from energy consumption. I mean, Denmark is a proven case in point, real time, that it has been possible.
Okay, this is very, Mike.
No, I want to talk back to the legislation.
Mhm.
Instead of making all this, do you think instead of making all these regulations mandatory, if you make it voluntary, do you think green growth would be difficult if it's not mandatory?
Yes, I think it's difficult. I mean, you can only expect so much voluntarily from companies or individuals. And back to the earlier question about whether it was difficult or not to introduce this transformation. And of course, it's not easy because you're up against vested interests, you're up against short-term interest versus long-term gains. So that is the role of national policies, of governments. That is to say, we want to go in this direction, and we would now like to seek a majority in the parliament for a certain legislation. And then that means that you are forcing some cost on companies, for instance, to clean up the emissions or their wastewater. Or, for instance, in Denmark, there's a hot political issue is water and making sure that groundwater stays as clean as it is. All water in Denmark is consumed from groundwater, and we drink unchlorinated water straight from the taps. We do not buy bottled water in the supermarket and spend energy carrying it in your car home. We just open the tap and we drink the water, and it's wonderful. And that is like a national treasure. What happened a couple of decades ago was that it became apparent that because of the very intensive agriculture in Denmark, fertilizers were creeping into the groundwater and were seeping into the rivers, polluting the rivers. And this was also back in the 1976, the first water master plan was introduced to try and make sure that we reduced the excess fertilizers that didn't stay in the crops on the field, but actually ended up in the groundwater or rivers and lakes. And likewise for companies, they were also came under strict legislation to try and reduce the amount of wastewater that they discharged. They needed simply to clean it before they could discharge it for the companies that were using substantial amounts of water. So that's an example of one policy area where you were up against interest in the agricultural sector and in the industrial sector, because by introducing this new legislation, you were forcing costs on the industry in the short term. But in the long term, it means that you are gaining because you're producing in a more sustainable way.
So how did the government explain this to the industry?
I think this comes back somewhat to when we briefly touched on governance in the beginning, which is also an important part of this transformation. There is a political culture, if you will, or tradition at least in Denmark, of a very inclusive political system, which means that whenever those kind of legislations are being considered, you would try and gather all the stakeholders together in committees, or you would have hearings, so you would get the input from all the Chamber of Commerce, the labor unions, etc., the environmental movements and NGOs and so on, to get their take on how can this be done in the most efficient way, and try to at least seek some kind of common understanding on what is the best way to move forward, and try and agree on the objective, and then agree on how to also get there. That's not always possible, but then in the end, at least the politicians know exactly where the different stakeholders in the industry stand when they make the final decision and they put a legislation forward.
So there's sometimes a discussion who should move first. So is it the consumers or is it the industry? How did this happen, or does this happen in Denmark? Is it an industry-driven? Is it this demand side, the consumer side driven approach?
I don't think there is a clear answer to that. I think it depends very much on which area of the transformation one is looking at. And I don't think there is a silver bullet. I don't think one can decide necessarily that one way works better than the others. I think it's dependent on the constellation of actors in that particular subsector. Does it have to do with energy efficient buildings? Is it about clean water? Is it about air, etc.? I think it's very dependent on which are the actual stakeholders in the field. I think the consumers are more able to drive changes, of course, when it has to do with consumer goods, demanding more energy efficient products that use less packaging materials, products that are not transported all the way around the world, and so on. But when it comes to more complicated issues like climate change, which is difficult for us really to sort of experience. I mean, you can't really see and touch it. Then I think it's a different matter, and maybe governments and based on academic research is more in the driver's seat.
One of the strategies what Malaysia is trying to pursue and recently started is government procurement. So the government is a consumer. In many economies, this is a rather high portion of the GDP. Even in Malaysia, it's maybe almost 20%. What experiences exist in Denmark is the government being a consumer and demanding efficient green products and services?
There are certainly a number of examples of government institutions, municipalities, for instance, which have taken decisions, democratic decisions, to be in the forefront, to make particular demands that certain products were of a certain standard. So you can say that they were pushing the envelope, and again, because they're a big consumer, they're able to drive changes in industries. In many areas, in fact, also at the national level, Denmark has set targets that are beyond the Kyoto Protocol in CO2 emission terms and beyond EU standards in terms of energy efficiency. So there is that wish to try and really push the envelope and be at the forefront of the change, because, as I said initially, we actually truly believe in Denmark that the next industrial revolution is going to be green, and we think it's the right way to go, even though it may not always be easy, and there are obstacles and opposition to be met along the way.
So this means behind this drive, there is more than just to be the good guys. Can you say it?
Yes, I mean there's also a belief that it's something that will be beneficial for the Danish industry. We think there is a business opportunity out there, and the fact that 15 to 20% of Danish exports are already related to energy efficient products or renewable energy products is a case in point.
I think the same goes for waste management technologies.
Mm-hmm.
Is this right?
Yes. Yeah, waste management is highly developed. What is happening is that most waste is actually now being, either it's being recycled, which it is to a large extent, or it's being incinerated and turned into heat and used in these district heat plants that I mentioned earlier. And so very, very little, just a few percent in the end up in landfills.
I have been only, I think, twice to Denmark and only limited to the Copenhagen area. But what I could see there, that the government is not only promoting to the public to do better, but also that the government is leading by example. So are all the government offices in energy efficient buildings in Denmark, or?
Well, whether they all are, I don't know, but they are certainly all meant to live up to certain environmental standards and energy efficiency standards. So yes, I mean they are wanting to push in that direction. We recently had the pleasure of a visit in April by the Lord Mayor of Kuala Lumpur with a large delegation visiting Copenhagen exactly to try and experience the greening of Copenhagen and why is it that city is repeatedly being ranked the most livable city in the world. That has to do with several things, culture as well and so on, but it also has to do with the fact that it's you know, the air is clean, the water is clean. You can literally and do swim in the harbor. You couldn't do that 20 years ago. But again, as I mentioned, there's been a major process of cleaning up discharged water from households and factories, and now people happily go swimming in the harbor right in the city, heart of the city.
May I ask one more question, because these are all so wonderful examples,
Yes.
and I mean that was a hope. I think the hope is already destroyed some years ago, that the developing countries will not make the same mistakes like the developed countries have done. You just mentioned polluting first and cleaning up later. So we see that the polluting first is also the way how it happens in the developed countries. So therefore it means we have a very similar patterns when we look at the historical development of economy. What of these measures, initiatives, policies which have been successful in Denmark, making Denmark as the most livable country, Copenhagen the #1 city in the world with the highest quality of life. So what of these policies and initiatives you would think can be applied also in the Malaysian context? You are here 2 years now.
Yes. Well, Denmark has actually worked with Malaysia specifically on an environment cooperation program for 16 years, both in the brownfield industry and wastewater, solid waste, also in blue, meaning oceans and coastal areas, mangrove, and green, the more traditional sort of national park rainforest and so on. And that was a collaboration which was both upstream, in the sense that it was looking at policies, assisting Malaysia developing energy efficient policy, wastewater policies, but also downstream by through a few pointed pilot projects which would show in practice what being more energy efficient could mean. For instance, the Diamond building in Putrajaya is one of the most energy efficient buildings in Malaysia, and was made energy efficient through a collaboration that was an element of this collaboration between Malaysia and Denmark. So there's been that attempt to try and I think to a large extent successfully try and pass on some inspiration to Malaysia about how to develop policies and how to communicate and facilitate that change, which Malaysia also seems to be very interested in driving, and the sustainable consumption and production unit in the Prime Minister's department is one of them, I see.
Let me reformulate my question before. I'm certainly this pilot and demonstration project and technical assistance is very much appreciated, but I think a pilot project is not what Denmark has changed on the way to green. So when we look at the bigger picture, so what of the strategies, the approaches, where you said legislation, economic awareness, education, would you recommend also to be taken by Malaysia? So in order to see a possibility to replicate to some extent, of course under different conditions, the success story of Denmark in Malaysia?
I think coming back to the 4 elements of legislation, subsidies, taxation, and education, I think the legislation, and again we've come back to that a couple of times. I think that is very important. I think for a country truly to change, you cannot rely entirely on the goodwill of citizens and corporations. But I think also you need to make a conscious decision to try and change the energy policy, for instance. If we're looking now, talking specifically about energy consumption, forcing changes in the way that energy is used, and the energy sources that are applied both in households and companies. I think that is necessary. Now that can't happen overnight. It has to be a gradual process. If you just abolish the subsidies overnight on electricity and petrol, I mean, you'd probably kill a lot of companies off because suddenly their costs would be driven too high and they're not profitable anymore. So it needs to happen gradually. But I think setting long-term goals is very important, because if there's anything companies certainly would like, it is certainty about which direction policies are going, and they can then adjust because they know that there's a plan for gradually phasing out subsidies on electricity, for instance, or other long-term policies. I think that's important to give, in particular, corporations and companies that guidance of pointing in a direction and saying that's the way we intend to move, rather than looking only 12 or 18 months ahead at a time.
Okay. I think Denmark, you have mentioned before, has set some very ambitious goals, far-reaching, some of them, because as you said, this cannot be done overnight, but become independent, for example, from fossil energy by 2050. And
yes.
I think this is almost 40 years from now.
Only 40 years.
Only 40 years. Only 40 years. I think does a policy need such long-term visions in our world where we see that everything is changing so rapid, and nobody could imagine 10 years ago that we are all now almost addicted to smartphones and such things.
Well, I think it's not about reintroducing a planned economy, and Denmark certainly isn't, but it's about setting goals and then how to reach that goal. The policies that you would need to reach that goal can be adjusted and changed in light of technical advances and other developments that happens over the years. But you need to point in a certain direction, because otherwise the transformation will not take place.
So you need somewhere a light in the dark, and this guides you.
Yeah.
Okay, and maybe how you arrived there, this would be another story, but you have to see that.
That could be another story. I mean, who knows? Maybe wave power turns out to be very profitable in 10 years from now. We don't know. So maybe the mix of energy changes in our case. But we have a goal of being independent of fossil fuels 2050. But I don't think anybody knows for sure by now, and it would be guesswork to try and predict what the package of energy that we use in 2050 would be. We don't know. Right now it looks as if it's a large proportion is going to be wind energy, biomass, but who knows? There might be energies that we're not aware of out there. Research that is just in its infancy at this moment.
Okay, Nicolai, you have mentioned before that some of these goals are derived from international commitments like the Kyoto Protocol. Denmark has even set for itself more ambitious goals because it's in the own interest of the country, as I understood. Denmark being a member of the European Union, so how much is these policies influenced by the European Union as a, let's say, a bigger framework, also with a lot of legislative elements, let's say on energy efficiency, on environmental policies, on...
Yes, I understand the questions. I wouldn't be able to answer with any big certainty, but generally, most of the Danish policies are having goals that are ahead of what is the EU consensus at the moment. That doesn't mean that Danish legislation is not heavily influenced by the legislation that comes out of Brussels. That is certainly the case. But we are setting additional higher standards, and we can do that. That's not contradicting any EU policies. We can do that. So we are setting higher standards in a number of areas, within particular energy efficiency and CO2 emissions and so on. So we are pushing. We are part of a small country which is just 1 out of 28 members of the European Union, and we are pushing the whole union in one direction, and we are probably somewhat towards one end of the scale of countries when you look at how far they want to and how fast they want to move in this direction.
What would be the rationale to be a small country and have higher standards than the rest of the world? Let's say that.
Well, I think partly because we, besides the idealism of wanting to do good, leaving that aside, we also think it's good business. We do think that by making that change, we're making the change which everybody will have to make sooner or later. I can't help thinking of an article that came out. It was actually a special report done by The Economist magazine about 8-9 months ago, called the Nordic Supermodel, where they sort of revisited the Nordic countries and looked at these countries which have been criticized for being having a very large public sector and welfare state and so on, and with a closer look realizing that these countries have actually reformed and they are still some of the most competitive countries in the world. They have the highest living standards. They must be doing something right, and in many ways they have, as The Economist put it, they have reached the future before many other countries in the world. And that is part of the answer to your question, that we think that is the way we need to go. We may make a lot of mistakes on the way, but generally we think it's the direction that everybody would need to go in the end, becoming more energy efficient and contributing to reducing climate change and so on. And if we don't start moving, it's not going to happen ever, even though we know and appreciate that we are only a very small global player.
I think this is a very a good message, which also, or we try to promote when we say connecting the dots for a better tomorrow with the SCP Malaysia, and to be already in the future, or be a step ahead. So it's certainly something which could also play a role in the ASEAN context for a country, better to be a step ahead of the others instead of having all these efforts to catch up with others.
Yes.
So this,
I think dragging one's feet can sometimes have the advantage that you don't need to do the mistakes that others do. But on the other hand, it means that you will always be behind. You will never get in front if you keep dragging your feet. Denmark would like to try and also share some of these experience and get inspired, because we need inspiration as well. So Denmark introduced a couple of years ago, together with the Republic of Korea, China, Mexico and Qatar, something called the Global Green Growth Forum, which is an annual event in Copenhagen in October, where leaders of governments or relevant ministries and CEOs of large international corporations come together for 2 days of discussing how you can promote green growth through public-private partnerships. It's about public-private partnerships, because no government can make this change alone, and corporations also need to work together with the legislative system. So that's one example of how Denmark would like to try and facilitate an international dialogue on how to promote the green growth transformation.
what would be an example of such a public-private partnership, an example of Denmark?
I think you can again look to the wind sector in Denmark, how the wind industry has worked together with academic institutions and public institutions like the Ministry of Energy on trying to develop some of these offshore, most efficient offshore windmill parks. So they go together, they combine the research efforts, and they look at the legislative perspective and what it takes physically to construct these rather large-scale offshore windmill parks, these big projects. So that's one example of trying to bring those forces together. And I think there's a healthy tradition in Denmark of working together between the public and private sector. It's not that the private sector is to any large extent at all government associated. It's not government affiliated companies. They're truly private companies, but there's a close collaboration between the private companies and the research institutions and the public institutions, typically ministries or municipalities.
Okay, this would be on the level of R&D, this kind of partnerships.
Yes.
On the implementation level, for example, in the building sector or in the waste sector or in the wastewater sector, are there such examples? Maybe I ask too much detail.
Yeah, I would love to dig out some examples because I know they exist both within solid waste management and water treatment and so on. So they do exist. Yeah.
To come a little bit more to the SCP, the sustainable consumption and production, when we talk about the consumers and the industry, of course they would need this infrastructure behind, the energy supply, etc. But on the daily life context, when we have started our discussion about the people changing their mindset, becoming proactive, not only following stupidly a certain direction, but becoming active part of the game. So coming back to this topic, what would you think Malaysia can adopt from these experiences? So that the whole society, or that SCP becomes a kind of a norm of behavior and methods.
Pushing on different fronts. I mean, education, I think, is extremely important. Trying to make people alert of the need to consume less water, for instance. Malaysian households consume a very large amount of water per person, and that's probably partly to do with the water distribution systems and the water that is lost during the distribution, but it's also because of the consumption patterns. So there's an element of education, and then also giving citizens more of an incentive, again, as there are also in Malaysia some rebate systems, for instance, for certain household appliances. If you buy a more energy efficient air conditioner, you get a rebate. So those systems, policies, they could be expanded to a wider range of products, and that way try and make sure that the consumer always thinks in terms of energy efficiency and not only look at the bottom line and the price, but also look at how is this product doing in terms of energy consumption, water consumption, and so on.
Okay, I think we are coming close to the time limit. Nicolai, you have mentioned before that Denmark has in the past already generously supported Malaysia with a number of technical assistance projects. Looking forward, Malaysia has still to close a number of gaps on various levels, also particularly in legislative aspects, thinking about how to better use economic instruments also in the part of education and awareness. How do you think is the possibility on the potential of a cooperation in this respect in the future with Malaysia? Not that much on piloting something, but in the field of mainstreaming, of improving legislation, policies, laws, which are not yet maybe at the level which are necessary.
I think Denmark has some strict policies around how we spend development assistance, and that was the reason why Malaysia is no longer receiving development assistance. So the cooperation between Denmark and Malaysia in many ways have sort of progressed from being one where the collaboration was funded and financed by development funds to one which is based more on a mutual government-to-government relation and also a business perspective, where Danish technologies are being applied by Malaysian companies and joint ventures are formed and so on. There are various ways that we try to engage Malaysia. The Global Green Growth Forum is one of them. And also the example of having the Lord Mayor and a large delegation visiting Copenhagen to see the green solutions for themselves are ways of trying to engage, and we're very happy to continue with that. Of course, we are just one relatively small country far away, so there's a lot of inspiration for Malaysia to find all around the world, but to the extent they're interested, and I know there is, that Denmark tends to from time to time generate some headlines in the area of green growth and energy efficiency and livability and so on. So we get those requests and we get that interest, and we are very happy to work with different Malaysian institutions, being KETA and the EPU and the municipalities and states on exchanging information, inspiration about how we've gone about the transformation and how we are going about the transformation still, because it's certainly nowhere near coming to an end in Denmark yet.
When we talk before, we talk of the role also in the context of SCP and the project which is done by EPU about the government role. And very often, myself, I'm a consultant. I have a background, luckily, to have also worked for the government. So, but what could be very interesting is, beside and beyond the consultants exchanging knowledge, that people from the administration of Denmark would be ready to share their experiences at government level again, for example, with Malaysia. This could be a new kind of cooperation, but would there be a readiness, for example, if a city planner from Copenhagen coming to Malaysia and share his experiences with, not the consultant?
Oh, I think there's been a lot of interest from Malaysia for getting, for instance, urban planners to visit. We had recently a visit in connection with the World-Class Sustainable Cities Conference hosted by KL, where they had invited as a keynote speaker a Danish professor and urban planner who's been advising cities like New York and Sydney and Moscow on urban planning to come here and exactly explain what is it that he would suggest that KL should think about if it wants to become greener and more livable. And the same urban planner and his company in Denmark was actually meeting the mayor and his delegation when they were in Denmark just a month ago, so the delegation could see what is it exactly that they've actually done in the to try and change the heart of Copenhagen, the medieval part of the city, to make it more livable.
Okay. Now, this is what I would say a new quality in international exchange, that not the consultants, but those who are actually responsible.
Yes.
In the policy making, who are doing the policy making, would exchange with other policy makers and decision makers. This could be a new quality in exchange, and I think we have with this opportunity talk with you because we can consider you as a member of the government establishment of Denmark to share these ideas. I think it gives a new quality when only talking with consultants.
I agree.
Yeah.
I very much agree. And we always try to look for those opportunities when we can. We also made sure that when the mayor and his delegation visited Copenhagen, that they got a presentation by the official city architect of Copenhagen, because that's the person responsible for the overall direction of the city in terms of architecture and building efficiency and so on. So yes, no, we look very much to try and engage those authorities and people who are in other ways responsible for the implementation beyond consultants, as you mean.
Maybe you cannot answer this question, but would the Danish government permit a person who is working in the administration to go on a mission to Malaysia and talk about how the waste management is organized in Denmark? Not the consultant, but somebody from the administration. Or would maybe your prime minister say, you cannot go, you have to work here, you wait for...
No. They certainly also do travel, and there are bilateral agreements that sometimes is the basis for that kind of collaboration. So it's part of a larger scheme. It's not just a one-off visit, but it's part of a continuous exchange, and that's something we are very happy to continue. We had the collaboration through the environment program for 16 years, and we're very happy to try and keep it going, because we think there's an important transformation taking place in Malaysia at the moment, and undoubtedly there are experience within all the areas that we talked about that can be shared. Yes.
Okay. Gentlemen?
I mean, on the same topic, I believe there's the program called is it the State of Green?
State of Green, yes.
Which supports exchange, where governments can visit Denmark, and they would organize a tour or program to meet relevant people. Perhaps you might be able to elaborate a bit further on this.
State of Green is a very interesting collaboration between public institutions in the area of environment and climate change and resource management, and private companies. So they have pooled some resources, and what they've done, among others, is they've established something called House of Green, which is kind of an interactive exhibition center right in the heart of Copenhagen, next to the town hall, where they can take in delegations, school classes and whatever, and introduce them to different aspects of the green growth agenda. And then they pull in the relevant resources depending on the wishes of that particular delegation. And again, the Lord Mayor of KL and his delegation had the opportunity to be hosted at House of Green. It was actually, I think, more or less the first thing they did to get that overall perspective before they then ventured out and saw more specific areas of the greening of Copenhagen. And they, we earlier had a dialogue about that UNIDO was considering a study tour on energy efficiency, and House of Green through State of Green would be very happy, I know, to engage with you on organizing that. I mean, they've got the resources, they got the network, and that's what they're there for.
Excellent.
No, I'm done.
I think it was very inspiring, Nicolai. I would say what the most important message what I got is that this has to be a collaborative effort of all the stakeholders, so that it's not just only one party which is driving the agenda. It needs the cooperation,
Yes.
and it needs the whole set of government instruments available, starting from legislation to economics and education and awareness. And that the most important, Nicolai, thank you very much, is to have a vision. And if you can say that the vision is to be already in the future, I think this is amazing.
Yeah.
So I would say that this is a great message, and I thank you very much for this inspiring information.
Thank you very much. It's been interesting to talk to you because all the questions you ask also make me reflect on things and think of it as in a new light, a new way.
Hope that we continue our discussion in the future.
I hope so too.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank
very
you.
much.
Thank you.